welcome to the podcast Transformations. My name is Nick Bank, and for this 15th episode, I have my guest, Mr. Andrew Baker. Hey, Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm well, Nick. Thanks so much for having me again. Pleasure
Great.
to be here.
Great. Good to see you. And we've been planning this for such a long time. Where are you calling in from today?
I'm based in the Seattle area now. I moved out here about 2 years ago from Chicago and live here with my wife and 2 daughters.
Oh, wow. Andrew, you and I, we know each other through the greater INSEAD network. I'm a fresh off the boat alum. You have been finished some time. But for those that don't know you, although that I did see that you were the president of the wine club when you were at INSEAD, yeah? So that tells a little bit about you. Yeah.
That's right.
But for those that don't know you, how would you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So as you said, I'm Andrew Baker, living in the Seattle area now. Formerly, recently of AWS. I've been doing lean OpEx transformation work since INSEAD, really. So I finished my MBA in 2017, and I've been doing this type of work for the years since. Started in sales and marketing, actually, primarily in med tech, med device, and then attended INSEAD and got this Toyota production system lean operational excellence bug in my ear, and have been doing that work ever since. Med tech right out of school, and then a pharmaceutical consulting firm, Discover Financial Services, and then most recently with AWS. I am available right now for anybody listening. Feel free to give me a chat. But I love this work. I think it absolutely resonates with the way that my mind works and the way that I think about the world, and process improvement and lean thinking is a very natural construct for me. And I really enjoy the work, the people in the space, and happy to be having this chat today.
Yeah. That's really great to hear. Yeah, I was also, so we say, bitten by the same bug many moons ago. It can be a difficult mistress at times, right? Because you always want to improve. So when are you ever happy, right? But in that sense, I think it looks like you and I will still be, we'll still have jobs for the years to come, even though that AI and everything else is coming along. There is such a huge area in terms of really about the people that are working in the processes, and the thoughts and the ideas that we have, that is for now. And this is mid 2023 when we're recording this. It may change with Skynet, I don't know, but as we're recording now, at least it's there's nothing really in sight that will give you that. So obviously with many new technologies, process mining, many other technologies that can break down much bigger data than you and I are capable of. But there is still something about standing there, for me at least, on the shop floor, engaging with people, having those conversations, and really agreeing on and what to do. And it's the same time, it's oftentimes it's very tangible, right? What's going on when you do the improvements in the business. So that's really great to hear that you have been moved into that area and had some good experiences there. And I was thinking, during our onboarding call, I asked you to consider some type of a transformative experience that we could talk about on the podcast. It could be something that you have experienced, in your personal life or your business life. I think it was on one of my first recordings. I think I personally defined transformation as something that had transformed at least me in a permanent way. And there were a couple of people that reached out to me and said, that's kind of slow, Nikolai. That's not very ambitious. That's like one change. So I actually had to go back and revise my own definition of transformation. So I'm curious, what would be your definition of transformation?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, obviously, since we first chatted, and I've really zeroed in on the impetus for change, which to me is why transform. And so the way that I've been defining it is transformation is when the pain of the current condition outweighs the fear of change. And I think Anybody who's done this work knows the resistance that you encounter when you even broach the subject of should we change something at all. Um, Folks have such a momentum in a process, and change is hard. And so I've found, and I'll relate this to my anecdote a bit later, but I've found that only when that pain in the current state is so great that they have no other option but to change, that's when folks are willing to come on board and plot, in particular, a long-term transformation.
It's interesting. I was reading as just the other day, actually on definitions on transformation. There was a person. I'll send you the reference afterwards. So he talks about
Please.
The the I believe he defined it as your fear of survival versus your fear of learning, and those were the two axes that he defined it on. So
Yeah.
it should be so important for you to move that it'll cost you your life almost, right? And only then,
Yeah.
as you say, and I agree completely, there is so much fear and anxiety related to any sort of change, let alone the level of insecurity, because we know what we have, even though it's far from optimal, to put it in a nice way. We know that there's room for improvement, but at least we know what we have, right? And many people
That's
will
right.
will will have that comfort rather than have something that's 10 times better but unknown, right? So
Right.
that's interesting
The
that you
devil,
that you picked that
is
angle.
comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think so. The first company I joined out of INSEAD, Leica Biosystems, is a Danaher operating company. And Danaher always says it's not about the people, it's about the process. And they frame that to avoid the punitive language, because folks can be very sensitive when you come to them and say, you're doing something incorrectly. But that's not true. It's the process that was designed incorrectly, and they're just performing it as expected. So I think if you can come in and say, so much, even in 2023, so much of what people do
mm,
is legacy, tribal knowledge.
mm,
They were onboarded and they
mm,
were told to do it this way,
yeah,
and they don't necessarily feel the creative license to change. And so I view process improvement and transformation as just giving folks the creative license to say, if you could design this, what would you do differently? And maybe they've never
yeah.
even thought that before. I think it's so
Yeah.
freeing.
Yeah. I was I'm just reminded, last year I was working with one of our graduates, and we had just recently started the lean implementation is this in this part of the company, and she was saying, oh yeah, that's classic, and then she called whatever our system is called, that's classic GMS. And we said,
Mm.
classic, it wasn't here 2 years ago, but because she was so new, she didn't have all the legacy. For her, it was, that was her current state, was that we actually had a relatively high level of sophistication in terms of tools and thinking and, KPIs and all these, talk about maturity assessment, talk about behavior, fairly advanced
Mhm.
stuff. But for her, that was just the norm. But for other people that have been there maybe 15 to 20 years, they were like, don't worry, this too will pass, right? So
Right.
it's
It'll
it's
blow
really
over. Give
about,
it two
yeah,
years.
yeah. So I think, sometimes, and I'm not going to ask you to bring a scenario, but let's say that you could have a group of people that have been there 10, 15 years, and you have a group of or graduates or people that were just hired within the last 6 months. I assume that would be a very different experience, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also like the experience that you described, because it sounds like that organization has a really strong culture of storytelling and mythology, where new folks feel like it's always been this way,
Yeah.
which is not always the case. Sometimes they hear the grumblings immediately, and they know that there's a history of difficult change, or as you
Yeah.
mentioned, zombie tools, where you launch them, they never really die, no one uses
Yeah.
them anymore, but they're still around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I think that in itself, I think, is rare, that an organization is able to make someone feel like there is a level of maturity and a level of thought that's been put into the current state.
Mm,
It's not
yeah.
always the case,
Yeah.
certainly.
No, 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 no. Far from it. I've also seen certainly variations on that theme, but I think it's interesting to hear you talk about the impetus of change, and I was wondering, where is that coming from? Is that for you as a leader, is that something that you define, or is that given, or is that developed with the team? How do you work with something like the impetus?
Yeah. So I've worked in organizations where there's a relatively low maturity in terms of lean toolkit, problem solving, process improvement. And so there is always a hesitancy to even define the problem, because defining the problem starts to point a finger. And no one wants to even go down that finger, because what if the finger lands on them? I think rallying a group of stakeholders around a problem definition that is quantifiable or is process oriented helps them abdicate a bit from the responsibility, and they can say it is the process, it is something organizational. And I think a lot to most folks, I think transformation means org design or org change, and to me, org design and org change are potential outputs of a problem solving process or a Kaizen event. And all too often folks jump to that saying, oh, we've been doing this all wrong. This team needs to live over here. This headcount needs to change. But to me, that's an output, not an incoming hypothesis. But yes, I think coming in to design a problem statement and to then dive into root causes, I always go to TAGS is the acronym that Danaher uses, Transactional Gap Standard. And the more that we can quantify the effort that we're going to put into place, the more we can remove the emotion from the design.
And I think that sounds my manager is also ex Danaher, so I'm certainly schooled in tax and bowlers and all these bits and bobs. Yeah. But I'm working on my thesis right now for INSEAD, and one of the things that has come up is that leaders, they spend 95% of their time in intuition land. So on the one hand, we have all this data that is telling us something, but on the other hand, we have already made up our mind. So as rational as it sounds, you as a leader, because for many people, experience is sort of qualified. Intuition is qualified experience, right? And there's some sort of pattern recognition in that. How do you work with those two worlds, intuition and rationality, so to say?
Yeah, I've certainly been assigned projects or initiatives that were pet projects of the CEO. And it was, I think we should do this. Go build me a business case for why we should do what I think we should do. And it's incredibly common. I'm sure you've done that several times in your career as well. And I think it's our role as lean experts to push back a little bit and to say, you may be right. Let's dig into the data a little bit. Let's go to Gemba. Let's get some anecdotes and let's see what's really happening. And then if the data suggests that you are correct, we'll get there. But I'd like to at first present the current state and what's actually happening before we dive into your pet project.
Yeah. Wow. And how has that been received? Just thinking, yeah.
I pride myself on being diplomatic. So I will say it goes well enough that I'm allowed to have that conversation. We may still do precisely what the CEO has prescribed, but at the very least, we're able to have the conversation. And I think that is a step in a lean journey, just to open up folks' minds and hearts to the idea that intuition is useful. And I agree with you, there's a pattern recognition element to intuition, but it's pretty rare that a senior level executive knows what's going on precisely on a shop floor or out in the field if you're talking about salespeople. So it is always useful to go to Gemba and hear what's really happening.
Yeah. Exciting. So when we first talked, we exchanged some ideas about possible stories to share today. So which story did you want to share with us today, Andrew?
Yeah, and it certainly pulls from that impetus definition. So I am a runner, have run since high school, and have struggled on and off with IT band syndrome. So for those listeners who don't know, the iliotibial tendon is the tendon that runs along the outside of your leg and it goes all the way from your hip down into your foot. And so it can manifest in pain anywhere along that continuum. So I've struggled with this syndrome since I was 17. So gosh, 20 years now, on and off. And I pull from that reference, the impetus references, because pain in this situation was quite literal. It hurts a lot when you aggravate this, and it can hurt in so many different places in so many different ways. And the root cause analysis and the fear of admitting that the problem is indeed what it is, for me, happens the same way every time. And it's very similar to the change curve, where you have denial. You don't want to admit that this is really the problem. No, I can keep running on it. It'll be fine. It'll go away. But so specifically, I had an incident. It's been about 18 months now. And I was getting back into running a bit more seriously. And the mountains around Seattle, I live east towards the Cascades, are beautiful and tempting. And I got really excited and started running harder and longer and heavier and up this steep terrain. And I went on a run. It ended up being about 9 miles around a local mountain here. And the last mile of it, I thought, oh no, like I've done it again. I've aggravated this IT band. Something's not right here. And it was so painful for the remainder of that day and the week beyond. I thought, okay, I am at a stage in my life where I don't need to run. Running is fun for me, but I don't need to do it right now. Let me take a step back and really evaluate what's causing this problem so that I don't have to deal with it ever again. Life is long. I hope to have a long running career ahead of me, but it's so difficult to just pause and evaluate and understand what the problem is. And at this stage in physiology, there's a lot of literature about IT band correction and exercises you can do. So I did. I took almost a year off running, and I read everything I possibly could about ways to correct the muscular imbalances, way to rest the tendons and the ligaments in your leg. And I dedicated that time to shoring up the imbalances in my body, so that when I got back to running, I was able to do so pain-free. And to me, that denial of the problem and the pain and the likely root cause is at the crux of any transformation. It is, to your point, there's some intuition, there's some gut feeling, is I think this is going on. But there's the fear of admission, because you know you'll have to make a change. And I really denied this problem for 17 years, something absurd. I just kept going back to it, like, okay, I'll take a month off, the pain will go away, and then I'll go back to running and I'll injure myself again. And what I love about specifically the continuous improvement model is that there's always time to fix things. It's culturally built into the system that we should be measuring everything all the time, and we should know and stop something before it gets so bad. And I generally know, right? Like about a week before it's about to get really bad, I'll feel a little twinge, I'll feel a little ache, I'll be a little sore. Like, well, no, it's probably something else. I probably slept on it funny. I did a different exercise yesterday. It's probably just that. I'm playing too much golf, right? Something's odd. But to sit back and to be honest and to admit that the problem will require long-term strategic deployment, and in this case, a series of exercises, I think that's really painful for people to do. And even the admission that you're going to have to stop doing something that you really love for a little while is sometimes enough to make folks not pursue the change.
I'm tempted to interject here, because when I was doing my interviews on the System 1 and System 2, there was a leader that said, it's not often that we have, the person words, the luxury of System 2. It's not often that we have the luxury of saying, I'll just take a year and we'll get to the root cause. And, if I have to play the devil's advocate, coming out of production, I would say something like, to me, the biggest containment or short-term countermeasure, as you'd probably call it in DBS, is just to stop, because then you're not producing any bad units. But that will only last for so long. Within minutes or maybe half a day, somebody's going to call you and say, "Hey, what's going on with my factory? How come I'm not getting any widgets?" or whatever it is. So
Yeah.
so I think it's, while it's admirable, how would you apply it in a professional sense? In terms of saying,
Yeah.
here you had a personal project, and there are other ways to get healthy. There are other ways to whatever your goals were. And here you took the time, you're rational about it. You looked at the data, you took a time out, and you had different sensory experiences. You had a good body awareness. It sounds like you knew what worked, what had worked in the past. But would you apply the same approach in your life, or in your work life?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good push. I think I might argue that taking a week to rework a manufacturing line and avoid the defects is a lesser customer risk than shipping bad units. And so I think anything in process improvement is relative. So if you're going to ship a 1% defect rate and you're going to get complaints on those and you could potentially lose a long-term customer, that to me is actually the greater risk than to take a beat, evaluate the process, and start shipping good units with proactive communication. Like you say, don't just stop shipping and wait for the calls to come in. Proactively, hey, fault in the line, we're fixing it. We'll get good units out next week. In my experience, and particularly if we're talking about production systems, oftentimes the fix, I don't want to overgeneralize, it can happen quite quickly. I think if you have a good bead on your process and you understand where the faults generally occur, usually a deviation is simply that, right? And you can make adjustments and get the units back on time. But I agree with you. Anytime you're taking that beat to make the change, proactive stakeholder and customer communication is at the forefront.
So you took the time, and I'm sure you went about your root cause analysis. How are you doing today?
Yeah, so oddly enough, I'm faster and stronger than when I was before, which anyone will tell you if you have an overuse injury of this type, it's because of a muscular imbalance or a lack of strength in certain areas. And so I really took a year and went into metabolic weight training, which I had not done historically. I rode crew at university at Notre Dame, but we had a very kind of loose exercise program. It was more about getting on the water and rowing. And so this was really the first time I had dedicated myself to a thoughtful approach to weightlifting. And my body is totally different than it was 2 years ago. And with 2 young girls, I'm required to lift things over my head quite frequently, humans over my head quite frequently, and shoulders and things. And so it's allowed me to do things that I didn't even realize that I was so limited in before. And so the accidental byproducts of this rework are many and wondrous to me to this day. I feel so much better and so much healthier. And I think that comes with taking that beat and analyzing what was going on. And Danaher uses I think it's a Howard Deming quote that is, you can only expect what you inspect. And I think that approach to life and business is so useful. And if you're just, I'm a big fan of delegation and a lack of micromanagement, but if you're not looking, if you're not even aware of what's going on in your processes, you can't possibly hope to fix things or to reach an optimal level of production. And so those are the happy benefits that I found of my personal situation is by looking around and pursuing these countermeasures and courses of action, I've found so many other incidental benefits of having this system in place.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you share the DBS stories. I had a guest on, Sabrina, that talked about how she applied the Toyota Kata in her personal life and later on in her professional life. And I think when I read that the first time, many years ago, it really hit me also. There's something about the structure I really wrote, and I also wrote something about, like, under the header of something like discipline, right? Pardon the pun, but there is something about that. There is this structure and the discipline about doing this. And at the same time, I was working in a company a couple of years ago where Lean was actually headed out of HR. So it was run by psychologists, and it was all about
I
behavior.
love
And
that.
one of the things that they said initially, which I found, so we say, surprising, was that this idea about that, it's faster to act yourself into a new way of thinking than think yourself into a new way of acting. So we can sit here and think about how great it would be to go for a run, and wouldn't it be great, and so on. Or you can just, like, go for a run and see how it feels, right?
Yeah,
So there's
yeah.
something about getting a quick start, but at the same time knowing exactly what you're looking for. What are the indicators that are going to tell you, do you have more
Hmm.
pain, do you have less pain, do you have interrupted sleep, do you have changes in your heart rate, changes in your mood, changes in whatever relationship to your partner, or
Yeah,
many different ideas. And if we don't know that, then you may as well do that or something else, right? So there is
yeah,
something about setting up those experiments along the way and saying, okay, that's a great idea, but what is it that we're trying to accomplish here, right? And a
yeah.
lot of people, they just really want to go and try stuff because it's fun, right? And
Right,
it's,
right.
you sort of act out, right? And at least we're
Yeah,
doing something, right?
yeah.
And I think
Danaher's very big
in
on. Go
yeah.
ahead, please finish.
No, I'm just thinking, oftentimes, especially with managers, I really have to tell people to, don't just do something, stand there. And they find it completely counterintuitive because they used to, like, going and moving stuff around, right?
Hmm.
So, but I think that's a very different approach.
Yeah, I want to pull one of the things that you just said that I really agree with is that so often pain creates anger, and that anger influences everything else that you're doing. And so and I'll try to keep this in a business scenario, but for example, if someone is doing a process, is performing a process that they fundamentally don't agree with, or that they believe isn't optimized, it creates an attitude and an environment of, I'm doing this because someone told me to, I don't agree with it, I don't believe with it, and I'm really just disgruntled. Whereas the beauty of involving particularly first line stakeholders in a process improvement event, or they get the buy-in to design the change. And when they're performing that in the future, they're doing it with the knowledge that they've put forth something into the organization beyond what they might have normally done if they're on the line producing widgets.
Yeah, yeah. You'll see, certainly higher levels of engagement, pride, ownership,
Absolutely.
even expertise, right? And then, up to a given point, and that's why we, generally want to move at least senior leaders around, because there's a really different step or difficult step between being so we say, an expert leader to then switching to general management, right? And there we
Yeah.
want to have people that have maybe been in marketing. We want to put them in finance, and we want to have those guys go to quality, because there's, for many, the switch between, as I said, expert leader to general manager is really difficult. I think another thing that makes the transition very, very difficult for many is that as a department manager, you're usually looking at having as much information as possible, whereas the higher you go in the organization, you'll have an abundance of information. So that ability to switch between the different systems, knowing which to, this is the thesis talking, right? But the ability to switch between the two systems and saying, okay, this is just going to be pure intuition. I don't need to think about,
Mhm.
maybe dangerously enough, driving the car or doing shopping, or hopefully not spending time with the kids. But, there are certain things that are on autopilot, and we need to know
Yeah.
what those things are. And then there are some things that we need to think critically about. But we can't be super rational and critical about everything, because
Right.
we just don't have the time, right?
There's
So,
no time. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Uh,
think I often tell my clients and my customers, sometimes it's better the less I know about their process, because I can come in agnostic to the built up angst and emotions of the history of the process. And I try to say that both as a little bit of an out for myself if I haven't done the requisite research, but also I believe it. I believe that a fresh set of eyes is often very valuable, whether it's myself or bringing in some other outside stakeholders who can just point at something and say, why do you do it this way? This makes no sense to me. And there's probably a story, but more often than not, there's not. And the folks that are performing that action say, I have no idea. Like, this is the way I was trained. Okay, if it doesn't make sense to you, get rid
Yeah.
of it. Let's break it.
Yeah, and then people will sort of distance themselves a little bit and say, well, it was like that when I got here, and
Yeah.
and then okay, there are some things that we can change relatively quickly, and I think that's why certainly this element of trying to separate between, so we say, the ownership of the specific processes and then the outcome of that of those processes,
Yeah.
right? Those things are things we want to have an eye for. But I completely agree with you. I've also been assigned roles where my biggest qualifier was not knowing anything about the process,
right.
but working as a facilitator, right?
Yeah.
I'm doing a series of workshops now where I basically bring people in from all parts of the company. And I say, you are here because you have different opinions and you're from all across the company. In 2 hours, you have to agree. So that's the starting point, right? And then you sort of outline what is the process going to be and what's going to happen. But I think it's fair to say that I want to hear about the different opinions, but I also want to reach a level of consensus where we can finish today. So I think, and a consensus is not the average of averages, right? Actually, a consensus can be quite ambitious because it can be, a myriad of opinions that are condensed into some very, very rational thought with some very, very unique perspectives. And so it's quite challenging in many ways. But I think it really talks into that, if we haven't established the impetus, if we haven't established the why, the jump off
Yeah.
point, as you would probably say also, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the gap? Then any action or no action is as good as anything, right? So
Yeah, I think there's some real magic that can happen in those rooms when you get disparate stakeholders together, because I think you're right. The consensus is not usually one person thinks 10, person thinks 0, let's go to 5. There is some true creative generation that comes out of having those people in a room. We come up with something that no one in the room had thought of prior. But there's some alchemy that happens there. But I completely agree. It is absolutely necessary that before everyone gets in the room, they understand why they're there. I've seen some poor events where 2 or 3 attendees are like, yeah, I got invited, not sure what we're doing here, happy to help any way I can, but then they're on their laptop immediately and they're not with you in the room. And so there is certainly a lead up to a facilitated event that is a buy-in for the why and a buy-in for the impetus to get folks motivated.
yeah, fascinating stuff. And I think you and I can talk about lean and Kaizen events for many hours, and I hope we will one day. But for now, Andrew, I want to thank you for sharing this experience. It was really great to hear, you describing your long journey with this injury, the personal pain, your rational thought process, and how you worked through it. So now is the time on the podcast where through the wonders of modern technology. I don't know if AWS is working on that or if that is Musk. I don't know,
I'm sure they
but
are
we're gonna
somewhere. Yeah.
yes, exactly. But we're gonna be able to experience time travel. So I'm gonna snap my fingers, and when we come back after the break, you will have listened to yourself, and we will hear your reflections and maybe your advice to your younger self. So, Andrew, talk to you in a week. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for coming back on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Hello, Nick. I'm well. Thanks for having me back.
Good. Good to see you again. So, Andrew,
Likewise.
I am so curious. How was it like to listen to yourself telling your story?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I grew up doing plays and musicals, so I'm used to hearing my voice recorded, but it's always odd to listen to a length of tract that is just me speaking. Um, I think the format of your podcast is brilliant. Is actually what I'd like to kudos you to. Um, the opportunity to not only hear my voice but reflect on what was said between the two of us, I think is fascinating. And I'll even tie that parallel to Kaizen, which is an opportunity to take a time out from what you're normally doing and reflect and be thoughtful. And I found myself, as soon as we hung up the call, I was thinking about, oh, what did I say? What didn't I say? What should I have said better? And I love that your podcast is set up this way to offer that opportunity of, okay, we're speaking live, we're thinking very quickly, we're bouncing ideas off of each other, but let's take a moment to really reflect on what was said and come back and think more critically about it. So again,
Yeah.
kudos to you and to the podcast for setting this up.
Thank you. And I think we talked about this on the onboarding call, and the listeners don't know this, but that was actually one of the main reasons why I set it up in this format. Was, I knew what I knew, but to get other person's perspectives and to have that opportunity to reflect, like a built-in timeout. You're a parent, a
Right.
built-in timeout period where you can really go back and I actually find myself, going back and listening to it several times just to hear the different approaches. And certainly with video, it just adds another dimension, I think. So happy that you're enjoying it, and I'm certainly enjoying our conversation also. So after listening to yourself, which in itself can be a transformative experience, what are your reflections?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I left out, that I really smacked myself for immediately, was that problem solving isn't an individual sport. And the anecdote that I relayed, where I was thinking critically, I was analyzing my body, I think I left out one of the most important pieces of what I did, and what anyone seeking to solve a problem should do, is that they seek disparate opinions and they seek experts in the field. And so while I was pursuing this improvement of myself, I reached out to two different physical therapists, someone who specializes in myofascial release. I'm now working with someone who works in neurokinetic therapy, thinking about how the body compensates for itself and where the releases and activations need to occur. And so that's something that I immediately, as soon as we hung up, I thought, oh no, that sounded like I figured it out. I solved it myself. And Danaher is big on this too. It's not an exercise where you can go into a conference room by yourself and just figure it out. You need to go to Gemba, you need to consult different folks. And so I think that was my biggest jumping off point from last recording was, oh gosh, I didn't do that by myself, not remotely. There were so many other folks who helped me along that journey and who helped me solve my problem.
It's so interesting to hear you share this particular point, because sometimes we get this idea that there's a problem and like magic happens and problem is solved, right? And we sometimes attribute that to individuals. And after hearing your story, you talk about your leg injury, and you do this root cause analysis. It's very rational, right? I was thinking, oh my God, he's really thinking about it, and you took the right time. And I think you said something like, well, I came back stronger and faster, and you could rebuild your body. And I was like, wow, this is, you're really into it, and I was thinking, wow, you must have a lot of, advanced knowledge or access to some sort of information. But maybe we can expand that into how do we actually best, so we say, solve some of the problems and the issues that we face, right? Because one thing is to see it. I'm sure you're familiar with, if we talk about like the dive model or something like that, right? How can we sort of get an understanding of, grasping the initial situation, and then what? Because there are many organizations where the messenger is not heralded as a hero, right? You kill the messenger. So how have you worked with that in your career so far?
Yeah, books are wonderful. Obviously, I love books, and there's so much literature out there on really any topic around problem solving. You forwarded me an article over the weekend, an interview with Edgar Schein that was featured in HBR, I think it was. And so there are so many resources out there for someone who can just self-service and seek out what they want to find. I've found speaking with someone generates more of a a quick response for me and for the customers and the clients that I work with. A book is wonderful, the internet is wonderful, but having someone relay a personal anecdote or tell you about past experience, or in my situation, poke my body, right? Like having a visceral physical interaction helps to surface the pain point, I think, even more readily.
So a situation happens, a problem occurs, and then what? What is the next step for you?
Yeah, I think, and I feel like I told so many Danaher anecdotes in our last recording, so I'll try to pull from some more recent experience of mine. So I spent some time with Discover Financial Services, acting in a similar role, but so much of what we did there was lifted out of frontline pain points and anecdotes. And I think problem solving is, yes, you should seek the experts to solve your problem, to solution your problem. But even before that, you need to seek the experts in the pain and who's experiencing what's happening in the process, who can best inform your Pareto or your root cause analysis. And I think so often we skip to the experts in solutioning and miss the experts on the front end in problem definition. And so I think that's something I've always tried to do with my teams. But if we can imbue an organization in, you are valuable because you're experiencing the pain, I think that can go a long way. And I think that's so unnatural for people. If, for instance, they're performing poorly, the process is performing poorly, and they are the expert in this failing process. They are not the delinquent because they're not performing. They are the expert in the problem.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you talk about, that it's the process that's at fault, and at the same time, often we recognize the problem in one area, point of detection, point of occurrence, but many and points of cause, right? There are so many points in the problem solving methodology, but we sometimes, we generally see problems very late, and things that have been generated much earlier, or issues that have come up, problems that are just sort of cascading through the organization. And at least in my experience, you're usually not very, so we say, welcome if you come and say, oh, by the way, I come carrying this problem. So
That's right.
how do you work to make that a valuable relationship, that you have something to offer with the people you work with?
Yeah, it's certainly cultural at the organization level, but for myself, I absolutely brand Andrew Baker as a person who has an open door, as a person who is curious and who is interested to hear what other folks are experiencing, even if they wouldn't necessarily classify it as a problem at that point of recognition, right? It may just be a curiosity. It may be something they find interesting. So I've always tried to keep a very open door, open camaraderie amongst my clients and my customers, so that even if they just think something is odd or something is interesting, we can chat about it. And it's not they're bringing me a problem. It's not they're proposing a Kaizen 3 months from now. It's, hey, this happened. I thought it was kind of funky. Let's chat through it. And maybe there's a problem there that we need to solve.
Yeah. It's interesting. The more that we can build, confidence and a strong relationship with the people that we work with, we will hear about, problems before they're problems, because they're going to tell you
Yes.
about, like you said, like the funky situation, somebody saying, I think something is going on here, and then you have an opportunity maybe, to go to the line, or participate in some of the activities that they have, and it gives you a better understanding, and maybe have a different perspective, and you can begin to collect data, or begin to understand better, or maybe offer some sort of containment in that sense. But we want to see problems when they're still small, right? Because even the biggest problems, they started out as small problems. So
Right.
it's just that we thought that they weren't important at the time. But at the same time, if we look at all problems with equal, so we say, emphasis or energy, we're going to kill ourselves. So
That's fair.
obviously there is something about tying that to the voice of the process, but it would be interesting to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think how much earlier would we surface problems if we were always listening? I think, I mean, that's the great advantage of a good measuring system and
Mm,
tolerances. But anecdotally, and most of my work is on commercial problems where it's not a defect in a widget that alerts you to an issue. It's someone in the field. It's someone who has an inkling that something isn't quite right. And so you're absolutely correct. We can't cast a perfectly wide net and hear perfectly to everything, but the earlier we can hear about it, at least we can start building some hypotheses or start measuring more closely to the things that we're hearing
mm,
about. And so it may not cut the problem off immediately, but we may be able to more closely measure, better baseline, better solve the problem once it is elevated to the point where leadership says this is something we need to go after.
mm, mm. So let's go back a few years as you were just starting out. What sort of advice would you give the then Andrew Baker who just came out with the knowledge that you have now?
I think I'll keep that lens on what you were describing. It's so
Mm,
difficult to know what's important and what's not, especially when you're starting out in lean or in operational excellence. Because for me, I'll speak for me, you're hesitant a bit to think that you're right. You don't have the experience in this type of operation to say, oh, I've seen this before. I know what's going on. Let's solve it. And so for me, I was early in my career quite prone to sitting back and a wait and see. And, okay, that sounds like a problem. Let's give it another month. Let's keep our eye on it. Maybe we'll solve it. But I think you build relationships a lot faster and you solve problems a lot faster when you come with an active curiosity. And so it's not just, oh, that's interesting. It's, oh, that's interesting. Let's go one or two levels deeper. And it may be immediately relevant. And we're so glad that we caught it then. But I think I was quite passive when I first started out in lean, and I was letting problems come to me. I was waiting for leadership to tell me, this is Kaizen worthy. Whereas now I feel like I'm much more active earlier in the process, helping to identify um, and build a stacked rank pipeline of what we need to be working on.
so when we talked the first time, you told the story about the first time that you were exposed to the the Toyota story and sitting in class and
Yep.
reading some of these books. Was this very different from, should we say, who you were before, or have you always had this interest? I'm just wondering, where
That's a great
where does
question
this
for me.
come
No.
from, right?
So when I was first exposed to it, it felt natural. It made sense to me, but I don't think I had put the structure in place in my mind around the power of some of the simple tools or the power of the philosophy. And so, yes, I think I've been a natural problem solver maybe my whole life, but not with the confidence of the rigor and the structure. And I think ultimately that's what lean is. It is a framework through which you can walk in confidently to any room and to any problem and say, okay, lay it out for me. I promise you we'll get there. And I ran an event for AWS in the fall where late in the afternoon on day one of the event, looking around the room, I could see that folks were very nervous that we were moving further and further away from a solution as we just kept mounting the problems and the opportunities for improvement. And I had I had a sit down in the room and we took a break. And when we came back, I said, I can tell by looking around the room that you feel like we're out to sea and then we're not going to make it back home. And I said, I promise you, we have the tools, we have the minds, we have the information in this room to get there. Trust me. And over the next 24 hours, I promise we'll come up with something. And this room will come up with that solution. And I think that's really difficult for folks who haven't seen the process work its magic um, again and again and again, because it is so simple. And the beauty of it is its simplicity. And when you walk into a problem, it's easy to say, this is overwhelming, this is too much for me, but lean will get you there. And there's a trust and there's a confidence that comes with that.
Yeah, I think one thing is that there's a trust in the method, but it sounds like there's also a lot of trust and confidence building from your end. You have to take these people on this journey, right? And I know even from myself when I say numbers like 50%, people are ready to jump out the window. And my real number is probably 80%, but if I say that, people are not going to come back. So
Right.
at the same time, we have to start somewhere, right? So how do you work actively to build that confidence within the group?
Yeah, I think so. I always view my role in any organization when I come in is to obsolete myself. I should be evangelizing for the cause and the methodology so that folks can do this independently of me. And yes, especially in a room, I need the team to have the utmost confidence in me to get us to our destination. But in conversations in that setting, I'm taking myself out of that. I'm saying there's this body of knowledge that's been at work for decades now, for thousands of years fundamentally. And it's not me that you need to have trust in. It's a very firmly rooted system of beliefs and a toolkit that will guide us there. Now I may be the mouthpiece for those things over 48 hours, 72 hours, but it's not me that you need to have confidence in. It's a very well established body of work that I'm just walking you through, right? I'm the shepherd on this journey. I will get you there, but it's not so much me that you need to have confidence in. I try to back that off a little bit, and especially because I need a really strong project champion for anything that I'm working with. I don't want to be the guy in the room. I want to be the guy next to the guy, or the guy next to the woman who's really the leader. And so I try to take a step back and say, I'll get you there, but it's not Andrew Baker leading you to the promised land. There's a set of fundamental tools that we're going to use.
So the element here of the curiosity, I was wondering, do you think that maybe there's a more, should we say, more general lesson here to the way that you live your life and the way that the people that surround you, that will they be able to recognize that if we were to bring somebody in the room and you say, yeah, I'm a such and such person. Do you think it's the same Andrew Baker?
I think it has been for a few years now. I think growing up, I was not this person. And I was not that person, I think, at university and in my early 20s. I think some folks that I went to high school or college with sometimes have a real cognitive dissonance about who Andrew Baker was then and who I am now. And so I think the short answer is no. I think a person can change and a person can evolve. And to go back to our slightly pre-recording question of can people change without certain coercion? I do think the answer is yes. And I'm a terrible optimist, and I do believe in fundamental change, even in individuals. Um, but no, I think this is something that I have cultivated very intentionally that now I cannot turn off.
And I'm the chef in this home, and even before I finish the first dish, I'm already thinking about improvements. And my wife will say to me, "It's like, please, can we just have dinner? You don't need to improve and give feedback on everything." So I'm certainly bitten or smitten by the same bug, but
Right.
at the same
It
time, you have
pervades
to
all
wonder.
aspects of your life, certainly.
Yes,
This
yeah,
needs a little
and
bit of
it's
lemon. There
yes.
should have been some fat here, certainly.
Yeah, some salt or something, right? And at the same time, you have to wonder, like, so when is it enough? When is it good enough, or when is it enough for you?
It's not. I can speak quite candidly for myself at this point. I know myself well enough to know that even and there's the arrival fallacy that everyone's now familiar with, but there is no achievement that will garner perfect happiness or to allow you to live a happily ever after, because you still have to wake up the next day. And once you've built this system in your mind, that next day is another opportunity for improvement. And the Kaizen philosophy is certainly um, a stairway to heaven, but each step that you take, you're still 7 steps from that heaven. from that 7 steps from achievement. So you're walking from that 7th step to that 7th step each and every day. And so to me, there is no arrival, but I've rather recently found some peace in that every day there's something to be achieved. And there's some comfort in that, where I think folks strive so much early in their careers for the idea of arrival. I've made it, here we are, okay, I can just live the rest of my life in this perfect bliss. It's not true. And I think it's a little sad that we've put that idea on a pedestal. Right? What is the rest of life if you're not striving for something further?
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your experience, as well as taking the time and the energy to reflect back on it. I hope this experience was also useful for you, to give you an opportunity to share your experience and to think about it again. So, with that, I want to say thank you, and thank you for your time. It has been great talking to you. I hope to meet you in person one day. That would be great.
Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure,
Yeah.
Nick. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and take care. Thank you.